I'm Marc Settembrino. I'm an associate professor of sociology here at Southeastern Louisiana University, and I'm currently the Women's Hospital Endowed Professor of the Humanities. And part of my work in that endowed professorship is that I'm creating a new course called Yoga, Inequality, and Social Justice. And that course is going to critically examine the origins of social inequality in our society and begin to explore how we can apply yoga philosophy and practices to address that social inequality. So in the course, students are going to meet internationally recognized yoga teachers and activists. They'll develop a personal yoga practice and we'll begin to build community through service learning. And so that course and this panel discussion today are funded in part by the Women's Hospital and the Louisiana Board of Regents Support Fund. So today I'm joined by M. Camellia, Rebby Kern, and Daniel Sanito of the Trans Yoga Project. We're going to be talking a little bit about their yoga practice and how their yoga practices inform their social justice work. But I want to take a moment to pause here, and I didn't. I forgot to let my guests know that I was going to do this, but they're going to be very familiar with what it is. So at the time that we're filming this, it's also Native American Heritage Month. And so I think it's really important to begin with a little bit of a land acknowledgement. And so I live on the unceded lands of the Tangipahoa and the Acolapisa people, who are part of the Choctaw or Choctaw people that lived here in Hammond, Louisiana. Tangipahoa means ear of corn, or also those who gather corn. And that's the name of the parish that I live in. Due to colonization, it's believed that the Tangipahoa people and the Acolapisa people merged with the Homa Nation. Today, the United Homa Nation and other indigenous communities here in Southeast Louisiana are facing off against climate change, and Hurricane Ida had huge impacts on their communities, and we have an opportunity to support them in the recovery work. And so I'll leave a link in the description of this video, but if you'd like to contribute to the United Homa Nation and their recovery work, you can do so at unitedhomanation.org/donate. And if you'd like to learn more about the indigenous people whose land that you occupy, you can visit native-land.ca. And I'll include a link for that as well so that you can do some of this important exploration work on your own. And so without further ado, I want to get to our guests today. These are folks that I have worked with that I actually consider to be very dear friends of mine and people whose work I truly respect. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and I'll also include their bios and links to their social and websites in the description of this video. And so why don't we begin with M?
All right. My name is M. Camellia. My pronouns are they and them. And I'm coming to you from traditional Nacotchtank and Piscataway land, which is known today as the Washington, D.C., Southern Maryland metro region between D.C. and Baltimore. And yeah, I'm one of the co-founders of the Trans Yoga Project, along with all three of these other folks. And I also do a lot of work with an organization called Accessible Yoga, working around disability justice and other different realms of access when it comes to yoga practice, and also to service and advocacy activism work more broadly. And I do a lot of work independently and writing independently, particularly in the areas of power dynamics, consent, and agency. So those are all things that I care deeply about. And more recently, I've begun leading some white anti-racist ally caucus space for a social justice-oriented yoga teacher training. And that has been new work for me, but definitely a learning experience and one that I value really highly.
Wow. Thank you, Em. Let's move on to Daniel.
Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs. And I am currently arriving to you from the land of the Catawba Nation, also known today as Charlotte, North Carolina. Um, I am one of the co-founders of the Trans Yoga Project, as Em just mentioned, and I believe Mark mentioned as well. And I arrive in space as a white, trans, queer, non-binary human person. Um, a lot of my work is wrapped up in creating trans affirming and gender affirming spaces in wellness realm. I do a lot of work with YTTs, with corporations, and with other spaces that kind of talk about wellness messages and use wellness practices and how we can create those spaces to be more affirming for trans and queer folks. Um, that's where I'm going to leave it today. I'll pass it off to Rebby in this moment. I can't think of anything else.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. My name is Rebby Kern. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs. And I also live and occupy the land of Catawba Nation, which has been colonized as Charlotte, North Carolina. And another element, just because Mark was able to share so much more about their native land as well, I think that what's been really beautiful to explore, there is a reservation just about 30 minutes south of the downtown area here in Charlotte. Um, and it often goes understated that there's these huge traders paths that have been a deep connector for a ton of tribes here, the Saponi, the Occaneechi, the Sugari, the Catawba, as well as the Cherokee. And being able to see so many of these tribes come together and reserve their collective power, Catawba Nation reflects so much of that work. And I want to name that and honor that. The center of my work has been in queer youth policy, where I started doing work at the collegiate level within colleges and universities, understanding how policies deeply affect the livelihood and wellness, particularly of trans and queer folks of color that navigate those systems. Moving and broadening this work out, I now am able to do this work in the state of North Carolina. I'm doing education policy work and from working with elected officials to work on the ground when tragedy happens on our college campuses. Our kids are not all right. And so when you talk about inequity, Mark, I really honor that. While I've become a yoga teacher along the way, my work has been seated here. This is the only work that I've ever known. And to also live it and feel it and breathe it every single day, I think we'll unpack a little bit more of that in that lens. And then I arrived to you as a biracial, non-binary queer person, and lots of other invisible disabilities. Yeah, I just acknowledge that I carry a lot of weight and pain in this very moment. And so things might get raw. So y'all are going to get a pretty clear picture of what this work looks like right now. And wherever you're tuning in from, thanks for being here.
Thank you all so much. And I think in my nervousness of doing the introduction, doing like these things for universities, y'all, is really just awkward. And so I think I forgot to share my pronouns. And so I use he, him, or they, them pronouns. I don't necessarily have a preference, but those are the options for you. Today, at least, I reserve the right to change my mind as we go along. And so y'all are doing some really exciting work in very different spaces. And there's also some similarity there in terms of your work on trans and queer issues. But one of the things that students often ask me is how they can get involved in activism. Like it seems like to like, it's one thing to be someone who's concerned about social issues, but sometimes my students don't know how to get involved. And so I was wondering if you all might want to take a moment to share how you got involved in, activist work or social justice work. Maybe Em, do you want to start and then we can pass the mic?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I got involved in social justice work pretty early, kind of marginally in high school, but certainly in college. I was a student organizer. So I was actually involved with a lot of organizations that were doing environmental, economic, and racial justice work at my university, as well as some gender equity work. And yeah, I did a lot of kind of volunteerism sort of stuff, a lot of door knocking, some fundraising, canvassing, that sort of like more formal employment based work through nonprofits for a little while in college, and a little while after as well. But I don't know that I would necessarily call that the core of my like activism, or even the most impactful work that I've done, despite it being the most formal work, which is to say that, you know, where I was coming from at that point in time was a place of holding personal identities that I understood to be oppressed, and having lived experience as a queer person, and as a non-binary person, and also as a person with disabilities, and yeah, I mean, a number of a number of other personal identifiers, right? And knowing that, to me, what I would have termed equality at the time, but which I have revised to say equity, was a very important value coming up for me. I would also say that at that time I didn't really know what that meant, which also is part of what's behind that change of terms, but. It really took until I had established a yoga practice and was working outside of real traditional business structures, that I started to engage more with more deeply held values, which was through practice and through further engagement with yoga philosophy, as well as other philosophical systems that kind of run parallel or tandem or even intersect in some ways, that are maybe not as linearly parallel, but create some interesting questions for exploration, or at least did for me. Um, and it's really from that place of recognizing the really, really deeply seated motivation behind seeking equity, seeking liberation, and yeah, working towards agency and freedom and a consent-based culture for everyone, that I would say my activism and my real, like, more impactful, or I hope it's impactful, it feels more impactful, social justice work got started. And for me, that currently looks like doing a lot of community education, and in a lot of cases, re-education, walking through unlearning processes as well as learning processes, and holding a lot of space for self-inquiry, which, like, for me, feels like it's making I've said it twice already, I know, but like making a much deeper impact on folks, because they're really looking at social justice and inequity and oppression and power, in the lens of their day-to-day life, and not holding it separate in the like, well, that's politics kind of sphere, right? Looking at it really personally, and then able to integrate some of what they're finding, what they're inquiring with, what they're learning, what they're practicing, into how they interact with their friends, their intimates, their children, their parents, and also their colleagues. And so taking a very different approach from this sort of breadth-based approach of like canvassing, door knocking, just trying to cursorily talk to as many people as possible, to working with a much smaller number of people, but in a much deeper way, I would say.
Yeah. I think you give a really important message in that as well, that, you know, activism evolves over time, and right, people's engagement in movements will look different over time. And so with you starting with door knocking and some really basic, you know, campaign level work, it was your beginning. And I think sometimes when we think about like, what is an activist, you know, you might see examples of people who seem like, you know, activist rock stars or something like that, right? You don't have to, nobody ever starts there, right? Nobody starts in a really advanced place. And so, yeah, there's lots of opportunities perhaps to get involved and begin your journey.
Yeah.
And so really it just takes that first step of getting involved.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
would say one additional thing on that is exactly as you're saying, Mark, like get involved at the level that you can, find the entry point that is going to work for you. And sometimes that is just skill building. But I would also emphasize that there's a self-inquiry piece to work, to any of the activism work you might engage in, that feels almost more important to me than than to start with the external work per se. Like in tandem, absolutely. Like get involved and start that process of self-inquiry that is going to motivate you to stick with the work and to come to the work from a very principled place, right? Um, rather than just kind of like jumping on to a task without much like thought into how that task actually needs to be performed to align with values, because that is where I see so much disconnect happening, and burnout happening amongst activist and organizing communities, that we hold these values as they apply to our larger social institutions, but we don't always apply the same values to the way that we're organizing, right? And the way that we're showing up. And that's important also.
That is extremely important, and that's something we're going to be talking about in the course. And thinking about how do you show up, and what is the relationship of self reflection to that, and making sure that you're also doing your internal work to uncover bias and in the work that you're doing, right? And so, Rebby or Daniel, do you want to share a little bit about how you got into the work that you're doing, or your activist journey?
I'll pop on. Yeah, I really appreciate everything that shared, and for me, it was a feeling. When I was growing up, I grew up in an intergenerational family, and my dad would always share these stories of what it was like growing up in the '40s as a Black man. So I was really clear about what it looks like to take action and what privilege really looks like. That to move into a space of organizing and building power means that there's an inherent element of privilege and access to be able to do so. And I think that there is a deep emotional calling to this work that that chooses you. I think, Mark, going back to your initial question, for folks that want to get involved, like that's the calling. And I think listening to that is all somebody needs. And then moving into that space of solidarity, I activate in ways that feed my soul and connect me back to my community. And that's, from recovery to BIPOC community to trans and queer community. That's, and deaf and hard of hearing community. I think that there are elements of I connect to that because that's how I feel disconnected to my world. And that then brings me connection to my world. And there's also connection into activism where folks are moving in that space of using their own access to power to make space for community. That's where I hear a lot of, white allyship, and Em had just spoken to what that looks like in action. And there's a deep call to that work. And yeah, the technical answer is I was an ASB kid in school. Yeah, I convinced my school community to vote for me because I was gonna, have better cafeteria lunches or something. And what that turned into is I learned what it meant to relationship build. And that's something that Adrienne Marie Brown talks about so often, and specifically in emergent strategy, that this is about relationship development. And if we're not centering how we're getting to know one another, then nothing's going to work. And that's why our systems are failing, because they're not centering people. Yeah.
Daniel, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, everything that y'all have shared is incredible, and I'm sure everyone listening will gain so much from all of it. And I think something that's like really important that both of you have named is letting the calling like meet you where you are. I think for me, a lot of my work started when I began my own yoga journey, my own healing journey, because it started to make me realize how almost isolated I was from myself. And the more disconnected I was from myself, the more disconnected I felt from everything and everyone around me. And so a lot of my work has been rooted in connecting to self in order, like self liberation, in order to create collective liberation. And I think this piece that Rebby mentions about all of our systems not being people centered, we're taught to be almost cogs in a machine. We're not taught to center our care, to center the care of the communities around us, to center care as a whole. And so a lot of the work that I do and have done is rooted in returning to that level of humanity, returning to that care for yourself, liberating yourself in one way, in every way that you possibly can, in order to create that liberation for those around you. And it really does, for me, it has always stemmed back to when I feel grounded, when I feel liberated, when I feel like I am in choice about where I'm headed, what I'm doing, um, and the impact that I'm making, that's when I feel like I can uplift and really support those around me. And when I feel diminished, depleted, disempowered, when I feel all of those things, I don't feel like I can uplift anybody else. And all of this work, I don't, the word activist never felt resonant to me, because we think of activists, and like you said, Mark, there's almost like this, you think of certain things when you think of that word. And for me, I've tried to step into like this educator role where I can support people learn in their learning and their unlearning and their relearning, so that they can be empowered to find the practices or find the ways of entering an activism sphere that work best for them. Because there are so many shoulds, there are so many like expectations for ways of being. And when we put those expectations on ourselves, it becomes hard to continue in the work when there's not intention behind it. But when you find what aligns with you, like Rebby said, from whatever age it might be, like Em said, when you find it, that's when the burnout starts to dissipate and you can really move forward in your work. And knowing that it will evolve over time, because you evolve over time. And that's great. That's incredible that the evolution of your journey is the evolution of yourself, because we're constantly going to be needing something different, something new. And so that element of continual exploration of your own journey, and in turn the liberation of your communities, is a huge piece for me that I try to bring into all of the places that I teach at, like education wise and consulting wise, and that I try to bring into my own practice. And those are kind of the connecting threads in my world.
Wow. Yeah, y'all are dropping a lot of really just important information on folks right now. And so I want to maybe unpack a little bit of it, and maybe show some through lines that at least that I'm hearing in your stories and your experiences. And it sounds like for the three of you, something that's similar is like a sense of disconnection from self, or even a sense of like alienation, like being in a society where you are othered or you are different. And I think that's something that's important to name, is that even folks like myself, I'm a fat queer, and, a lot of my political work comes from being a fat queer person who just wants to be able to exist without having to deal with transphobia, homophobia, anti-fatness, right? And so for people who are marginalized in some way, right, our existence sometimes alone is a challenge to the system. However, there are lots of folks who get involved in social justice work who have a lot of privileged identities. I have, as much as I'm marginalized for being fat and queer, I'm here as a white person with a lot of education, right? And so that's where that self-reflection starts to come in, and starting to identify and examine all of these different parts of you, and understanding these larger systems that you're participating in. However, that's like the advanced part of activism, right? Like sometimes it really doesn't, it does mean that like joining a club on campus that is aligned with some sort of political work that you're interested in, and starting to get involved in some way, right? In the same way that, nobody walks into a yoga class on their first day and does a handstand, right? So you know, there's a lot of opportunity for work. And it sounds like as well that so much of what you're doing, Daniel and Rebby, is trying to build a life for yourself that honors your humanity, and then a larger community and world that honors our shared humanity, right? And beginning to move towards that in the relationships that you have and the spaces that you occupy. And I think that's a big part of social justice work, right? Like is remembering that we're really trying to build a society that's going to honor that shared humanity so that all of us have dignity and respect, right? At the most basic levels. And I think that's really important. We've started to think a little bit about yoga. And so I'm wondering if any of you would like to maybe just give a few sentences on what yoga is to you, because I think that what some of the mainstream ideas about what yoga is may not always align with how folks actually live yoga. So I'll leave it up to you to see who wants to begin.
We might wait for hours. I'll jump in first. Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for this. Yoga for me has become a lens to see the world through, and it starts with my side of the street. And that's a phrase that comes up in my own recovery practice, that I do not have control over people, places, and things. And yoga helps me witness that and stay on my side of the street, which is really a challenge for me. And
We lost you for a moment. We heard and.
that's okay. Go ahead. Go ahead.
So yeah, yoga helps you stay on your side of the street. Learn that you can't like control other people, places, and things. That's huge, right? Like, I think we can all benefit from that. Em or Daniel, do you want to add?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of answers that I could give to this because yoga is quite literally everything to me in terms of like it is the material and non-material reality around me, but also the framework through which I'm looking at that reality, right? And interpreting our systems and interpreting what I see and what I think, what I imagine, and what I experience. So it's very broad. But I think like I would point just to the actual meaning of the word yoga and its Sanskrit roots, the root word being yuj, which means to yoke, or to join. So yoga being literally union or to unite, bring together. Um, and for me, that conjures interdependence and um, that is, I guess, how I like if I had to assign a word to my understanding, it would really be that interdependence that we're all yoked together just by nature of existing. Um, and we are all always in relationship with everything and everyone else in existence, even if that relationship is defined by our never having met, our not knowing each other, our not having much in the way of shared experience beyond just the basic of being humans in existence at this time. And I think it points to this innate tethering between how I behave on my side of the street and how you experience your own side of the street, if that makes sense. That like everything I do, the conduct, the speech, the relationships that I build or don't build have impact well beyond myself. And therefore, it instills in me a sense of deep responsibility, both to myself, knowing that when I'm under resourced, when I'm not taking care of myself, when I don't have community around me offering support, that I can't show up in ways that are going to impact those around me beneficially. And also that if I'm not working to ensure access to the resources that other people need to exist in the world in not just comfortable but pleasurable ways, that I am going to also lose access to that sort of support and resource, right? Um, and that's what I mean by that yoking and interconnectedness. And I think that's where I would place my central definition for now.
I'll just hop right on because a lot of what you said resonates, and a lot of it, similarly, Rebby, a lot of what you said resonates. And I think that yoga is so frequently thought of as solely a physical practice. And if not solely a physical practice, there's, we know there's some philosophy, maybe we meditate, something like that. But yoga is, it's a way of being. It's like, for me, it's everything in my life. It's how I exist in this world. And it saturates my whole world because it has taught me not only the interconnectedness with all of the various layers of who I am and every expression and iteration of who I am. It's taught me how to hold space for myself, and in turn taught me how to be in conscious, aware, mindful relationship with everything around me. And just through that practice, I think that's like, for me, where it links a lot with the social justice work that I seek to do, because these these are it's all rooted in liberation for me. It's all this practice of personal and collective liberation that are inherently connected. We are all inherently connected, to one another, to everything around us. We are nature, and all of those wonderful things. And as we seek to create a more equitable world for all beings everywhere, that is what yoga is to me. And so I think the biggest thing that I can say about what is yoga, or how did you come to yoga, or how did you start practicing yoga, it's a daily, every single day practice. It's not just an asana practice, it's not a meditation practice, it's not one specific thing, it's all of it, and it's full embodiment of all of it. Yeah, and that's kind of where I land with that.
Um, Daniel, thank you for naming that yoga is more than a physical practice, right? And I think that's essentially what Em and Rebby, you were speaking to as well, right? In our popular understanding of what yoga is in the United States, it's probably this, idea of making funny shapes with your body, maybe in a really hot room, maybe with some like really, relaxing music playing or something like that. Yoga in the United States has really been incorporated into like the fitness industry. And so there's a lot of emphasis on the physical practice. And that is a place where many people begin. That's where I began, right? I began with yoga as a physical practice. I'm sure it may have been the same for you all. And so again, a little bit of a parallel here in understanding that like an activist or a social justice journey and a yoga journey, like you're going to start at the beginning, right? And that may be with a physical practice. It may be with a meditation practice. It may be even with a journaling practice when we think about things like svadhyaya, right? And so um, one of the things we'll be doing in my course is we will be studying the Yoga Sutras, and so we'll be getting some of this yoga philosophy and thinking about how do we begin to live yoga? How is yoga more than just a physical practice? I'm wondering though, for maybe some folks who are like going to be new to yoga, it's very likely that some students will be joining me who've never practiced yoga before. um, you know Maybe you could share a little bit about what does your practice look like, right? Like we've mentioned that it's something that you live, right? And that it's something that it is something in your day to day. But how are some of the ways that you practice yoga? What are some examples of that?
I'll start with this one. um, I do practice yoga asana as well, which is the physical practice. That is definitely something for me, existing in this world as a trans person. Access to my body wasn't something I grew up with. Kind of living in my physical space wasn't something I was ever really comfortable with up until I started practicing yoga. And even now, there are days where that fluctuates. There are days where that's not as accessible. And so yoga asana is definitely a large part of my practice still to this day, um, because that allows me to return home, to return back to myself. And it regrounds me in space. So when I can be present with my body, I can kind of be present for my day in a lot of ways. And so that is definitely still part of my journey. I do meditate, not as frequently as I would hope to, and it's a fluctuating journey. Um, but again, like we were talking about, because it's such a way of life, it's when I'm doing the dishes, can I be mindful of doing the dishes instead of thinking about the 15 other tasks that I have to do later that day? How do I return to present space? It kind of, my yoga practice really gives me an opportunity to arrive in each moment and arrive with curiosity, knowing that none of it has to be, no part of my life has to be rigid, has to be stagnant, has to be anything that bogs me down, and I'm in choice about all of it. And so when I arrive with curiosity, when I show myself compassion, when I let myself be present with each thought, with each task, with whatever it is that I'm doing, that really shapes my world. And I think for so many of us, we are almost at the mercy of our thoughts. We live on autopilot a lot, and so our thoughts are creating our world, and we're just kind of on the ride. And when we can harness our own thoughts, when we can become aware of our own thoughts, when we can kind of shape our reality, and I say that's not necessarily the phrase that I want to use, but when I can understand where my thoughts are taking me and what journey they're bringing me on, even if I let them bring me on that journey, at least I'm aware of it. At least I'm not just kind of floundering in space. And I think that's one of the biggest practices that I engage with daily is knowing that my emotions will fluctuate, my thoughts will fluctuate, every experience will fluctuate, and I can be present and hold space for all of it. It doesn't have to be good, bad, right, wrong. It just is my experience. And I think the permission to hold space for myself is how I show up every day in my yoga practice.
For me, especially coming from the lens of interdependence as sort of the working definition that I'm operating from, I think all of my practice right now is rooted in tending my relationships. And I mean that very broadly. So that definitely means my interpersonal relationships and spending a lot of time thinking through, working through. Everything that could possibly come up as challenging, as tension, or as pleasure and delight within my interpersonal relationships. Like that is practice for me. Kind of working with my collaborators, with my intimates, with my family, and with colleagues and whatnot who I'm in relationship with to navigate like what is the truth of our connection to one another on a more spiritual level, but also on a like real reality based level. Um, what do we mean to each other, and what responsibility do we have to one another, and what is the sort of power dynamic that's at play here? And because we hold these values of equity, equanimity, and you know, in my case and for my community, and I think for everyone here, like agency, freedom, self-sovereignty, which also come from the yoga tradition, that it is really like, how can we better recognize the power that we hold in our relationships, whether that's with one another or with ourselves? Like, what is the relationship between my mind and my body? What is the relationship between like the part of me that is divine and connected to something much larger than any of this physical material, and this physical body, this physical material? Like, what is that relationship? And so anything that I do, it's less prescribed for me at this point in my practice than it used to be, which like it used to be very much like I take an hour out of my day to do this formal practice where I do some asana, some movement, and then I sit and I breathe, and then maybe I chant, and then I sit in silence for 5 to 10 minutes. Whereas like, oh, excuse me, so sorry. Whereas now it's like, what does my relationship need? What does my relationship with my body need today? Is that movement? Is that stillness? Is that presence while I'm doing home care or body care? Is that, you know, maybe that means like today I'm being extra diligent about taking my pain medication because I'm having an autoimmune disease flare. Like that is practice for me too, because I'm tending to the relationship I have with my body. And sometimes it's like, what do I need to bring to a relationship with a partner or a family member or a friend that is going to like serve both of our individual agencies, right? Make sure that we have resources and also the power that we need to use those resources as we choose and as we need. And so in those cases, maybe it looks like couples therapy. Maybe it looks like, just conversation that we've made specific time to be present for. Maybe it looks like practicing meditation in the same space and then coming out of that together and moving into dialogue from that place, right? Of kind of deep internal rooted connection. So I wouldn't say that my practice is very regimented or habitual, but it is very present for me all the time. It is always on my mind and it is adaptive to the situation.
Yeah, I really want to underscore here that because this conversation is happening in the context of systemic injustice, as well as yoga as an equity and personal practice, and yoga will not look the same for any single person. And that's such an important piece to underscore here, and that the yoga industry is telling people otherwise by the avatar of thin, able bodied white women who are cisgender and straight and have access to wealth, that they're the ones who are accessing yoga. And that is not the truth of where the roots of this practice have come from. And I want that to be named here. And so, with that being said, I hear and I see for myself the history of guilt that I've had of not meeting that, of not being that, and talking myself out of my ability to access this practice. And that's where I have shifted my social justice lens from, sexual orientation and gender identity and expression into how people are showing up on their mat and whether they even need to have a mat in the first place. So I'm here to tell you, you don't need a yoga mat to do yoga. My yoga practice has helped me navigate grief, and I don't really have any other way around that right now. Um, and in my social justice practice, it gives me an opportunity to really think back to what collective care looks like. And things are really hard. Like for me right now, really witnessing that I live in the city of Charlotte, which is one of the deadliest cities for transgender people in the United States, in the deadliest year for transgender people, in the worst anti-LGBTQ, particularly anti-transgender legislative session we've ever seen in the history of government. I am not accessing my yoga, and yoga is not accessing me in the same way that it might have. And going back to this relational piece and from this activism piece, who needs this practice the most? And how do we in this room become responsible to offer it to them in a way that the system will never give to them? And when you talk about marginalization, I operate and I'm not marginalized. I am here to dismantle the systems that seek to take power from me. And with that comes a deep sense of liberation. And that's that shift, and that's what is scaring dominant culture, because we are no longer accepting status quo, and I'm sure that term is going to come up in this class, session, course. um, And so this is really real for me. And so I want to also name that spiritual bypassing is a practice that shows up when people become addicted to a yoga practice and through the physical asana expectation, and that they then come through the sense of it is all good all the time, love and light, good vibes only. And what that takes away from is the picture that it is not good all the time. And I cannot yoga my way to undo trauma. Like yoga will never undo trauma. It will not undo white supremacy. Meditation will not undo the harms that have happened to so many of our communities. But what it can do is give us an additional lifeline to one another. And each of us have spoken so clearly to that. And Daniel, so much so, of what that lifeline looks like to ourselves. And to M's point, that looks like taking care of yourself first. And that's what that looks like for me right now. So I appreciate the question.
Rebby, I really appreciate you naming all of that. I think it's really important as well to acknowledge that we're sitting here as Western yoga practitioners, teachers, activists, working within a lineage that isn't necessarily ours, that came to us through colonization, and that as advanced yoga practitioners, right, as people who've moved perhaps beyond, just showing up for your Monday night yoga class, have started to become aware of how these systems operate and have influenced the practice, right? It's presented to us that yoga is, something that fit people do to remain healthy, and that's just not the case for everyone all of the time, and that even perhaps the people who most need yoga are the ones who don't have access to it, right? And so as yoga has become part of this practice for privileged people, I know the work that you all are doing in Trans Yoga Project and also in your communities is to make yoga accessible to everyone in various ways, right? So that yoga doesn't have to be something that people go to a studio to do. That simply having the relationships that you do with one another and the people in your community begin to reflect an opportunity to begin to honor humanity in a way that our society doesn't, right? Our society is, I'm going to go off on a little tangent here because I keep hearing about cancel culture on my campus, right? And there's like this really big backlash against cancel culture, right? There's this like, let's cancel culture thing happening in this moment that we live in, but cancel culture doesn't exist. Like it literally doesn't exist. What does exist is that there are systems of oppression, white supremacy, cis heterosexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism. Like all of those systems of oppression are working to cancel people, right? Like, and that's what's happening in our society right now, right? Our campus is going to have a Trans Day of Remembrance ceremony next week. I know TYP is having a Trans Day of Remembrance event. Like, those events shouldn't have to happen, right? Like, and there's no number of sun salutations that we're ever going to do that's going to get us beyond transphobia. It's inner transformative work that people have to do, and then it has to translate to the systems we exist in, right? As long as there are people trying to legislate which bathroom one another can use, or take healthcare away from one another, or make it harder for individuals to be able to get jobs, to have the dignity to be able to like feed and house themselves, then we're going to need social justice movements, right? And yoga is not the solution to any of that. And much like this conversation, this panel that we're having today, I'm hoping that the course that I'm offering in the spring will be the beginning of that conversation and that work for individuals enrolling in the course, right? Certainly, Daniel, you named it, and I want to name it as well, that like, the classical definition of yoga in the Yoga Sutras is that ability to still your mind, that ability to be present and aware of what's happening, and knowing that what's happening is not always going to be comfortable. And that's part of the asana practice, right? Like that's the tapas aspect of your practice, where sometimes being in your body in an uncomfortable way can translate to being able to have difficult conversations with people in your life, to make really important decisions for yourself that maybe your family wouldn't want you to make, right? So it's about developing this inner agency and access to your own power. I want to honor everyone's time. As we were going to be together for about an hour, and we're getting close to that. And so I just want to give you all an opportunity to perhaps share any last advice that you might have for someone who's getting ready to start a yoga practice or starting to do social justice work, and maybe let folks know if there's any place they can find you, or if you have any offerings coming up, if folks want to practice with you or learn with you or just be in community with you. So Rebby, do you want to start?
Thank you, Mark. For folks that are tuning into themselves in a different way, the concepts of patience and compassion come up, and patience as a healing tool to resist a sense of urgency, and that urgency can show up as needing to get it right now. Patience of needing to achieve certain shapes by a certain time, and the sense of urgency that any of it has to look a certain way. And instead, we're turning into access to yoga as a personal practice, and a way to relate back to the world, and that's going to look different every single day. And I don't hear that shared often in the beginnings of those journeys. And then compassion, I think Daniel talks about it so much right now, and what that looks like to come home to self. That's something that I really get out of their teaching. And folks can find me on Instagram at Rebby Kern Yoga, as well as rebbykernyoga.com, where I often hold workshops exactly in this intersection. Everything from personal gender exploration to what a decolonized gender approach looks like to the world, the intersections of injustice and wellness. And I'd love to welcome folks into that conversation, and that feels complete. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Rebby. I think along with everything that you just were naming, and what you were saying about spiritual bypassing, I think one of the like key pieces that I would offer to anybody starting a yoga practice or a social justice practice is that both of these things are ongoing. Like just at like we can find some level of equanimity, we can find some level of equity, we can imagine a society where we've undone all these systems of oppression. But just as quickly as we can imagine that, right? It, even if we created it, it can be undone. Like we are always going to exist with this same reality in front of us, where we have relationships, where we have some like apparent separation in the sense that we are like different individual bodies and beings interacting with one another. So as long as humanity is around, as long as this universe is around, there is going to be power dynamics between every individual being. And we can level that power off today, and it could be imbalanced again tomorrow. So, like, I don't just mean in terms of our own personal practice of moving towards equity or moving towards spiritual liberation, but like in the grand scheme of things, this will always be an ongoing practice. And that is something that is deeply uncomfortable for people all the time who are really, really invested in the cultural value of urgency, of right now, of get this right, and also B, people who are compassionate, right? Who really care about the people around them and care about the harm that has been done and the harm that is still coming, and care about the generations that aren't born yet and want to make sure that that world is better. And that includes me. It is still hard to sit with the fact that I will never, it's impossible for me to be alive for, a perfectly liberated world. And it is still hard to know that even if I could create that, it could change anytime, right? There's a big emotional and like psycho-spiritual investment that is undertaken on either path, or, what I think of as an integrated path. The last thing I would say with that is also something that creates a lot of discomfort, is that so much of this practice for me has been about accepting and sitting with paradox, and tension, and the push and pull between things that seem very different or opposite, but which actually, like, I've come to a point of basically only accepting things that are paradoxical as truth. That, like, you know, um, we have to take care of ourselves first in order to be in community, in order to be in relationship, and to care for the whole, right? That is sort of counterintuitive. It's sort of paradoxical because we would think we should just give everything we have to others, right? In the name of service or whatever we want to call it. But that it won't work because we are part of community. And if we are giving away everything that we have, we are not cared for. And therefore, community is not cared for, right? So I think just finding those things that feel like their intention and spending as much time as you need with them, like, to me, that is more important um, than doing any asana, right? Any physical practice at all. Which is not to say I want to devalue asana or physical practice. I think that some of us learn best in and through our bodies. And that's a super valuable way of knowing and way of learning and way of understanding the world. But it's not all that there is. And we're always going to have a relationship to mind as well. So working with that.
Where can people find you or work with you?
Thank you. Yes, I am on Instagram as well, Found Space Yoga, all one word. And that is also where you can find me, foundspaceyoga.com. And you can also find the Trans Yoga Project as well on Instagram. We are Trans Yoga Project, and our website is transyogaproject.com. We also have a Patreon where you can financially support the work, and that is patreon.com/transyoga. No project on that one.
Thanks. Daniel, what about you?
Thank you both for sharing all that you've shared. I resonate so much with all of it. And I think that you both named really, you've both like taken words out of my brain. So thank you for that. And you spoke to this level of like understanding where there's a level of understanding that we can gain through physical space, and it's a valuable way of understanding. There's a level of understanding we can gain through our minds. There's a level of understanding through our emotions and through our spirits. And so find what resonates with you. Again, every single day it's going to be different. The biggest thing that's been helpful for me in my journey is to give myself permission. I think when I give myself permission to create space in my schedule for my rest, to create space in my schedule for my healing, to create space in my schedule to show up in relationship, like all of these things, when I give myself the permission, it almost takes the weight off of this feeling of guilt where we're told we have to be producing all the time, we have to be existing in any specific way, because we don't. There's truly, when I give myself permission, when you give yourself permission, when we each give ourselves permission to show up wholly, I think that is the most pivotal thing that's worked for me and that I offer into this space. As you start a yoga journey, as you start a healing journey, whatever that looks like for you, as you start work in social justice, whatever it might be, give yourself permission to explore and find what lands well for you. And make time for your rest, no matter what you're doing, whether it's in social justice, in activism, in any realm, make space for your rest, because your rest is just as important as your work. And so that is just one thing I want to offer to everyone listening, is to give yourself that permission. And I want to honor everyone's time here. So I will wrap with that. You can find me at Daniel Sanito with an underscore on Instagram, danielsanito.com, and at the Trans Yoga Project, of course. And thank you all for being in space together. It was a joy to be with each of you.
Awesome. Thank you, thank you, thank you all for being here with me today. I appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to talk with me. And I really wish like there was some way that we could like team teach this class. Like, do y'all want to just like move to Louisiana and like teach this course with me? I'm so grateful to you all. And yeah, I just don't have the words to express it, how much I'm just in awe of the work that you all are doing. And so thank you to everyone who's watched. As a reminder, my new course, Yoga, Inequality, and Social Justice, is going to launch in spring 2022 at Southeastern Louisiana University. So unfortunately, it's an in-person class, even during pandemic times. So anyone watching this is welcome to take it, but you'll need to be in Hammond, Hammond, Louisiana for that. And if you have any questions about the course, you can email me at marc.settembrino@sclu.edu, and I'll be happy to tell you more about it. But thank you again, Em, Daniel, Rebby. Hopefully we can have some more conversations like this soon.
Thank you, Marc. I was heavy coming in. I feel lighter. And so being able to speak truth was definitely a good practice of yoga in this space today. So thanks for holding the container.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity, Marc. And of course, to my dear friends, Daniel, Rebby, thank you.
Awesome.